Hi, everyone. Um, so um, I'm going to discuss a bit about the Australian National PID strategy. So as you may all know, a PID is a personal identifier, but I wanted first to make sure that everyone understands the same thing about PIDs. So personal identifier is persistent. It means that an organization may promise that the identifier will stay there for a long time, for a very long time. And it's an identifier. So it's a globally unique string of alphanumeric characters. That means because it's persistent, it's not temporary. And temporary can mean that can be like something that lasts for 10 years, a long time, but it's temporary. And the PID should be longer than that. A PID has governance and international standards associated with it. And all of those conditions basically make accessibility and usability and reusability for a very long time. So, for example, piece that you may know is ORCID for people. You also have ISNI, which is the International Standardized Name Identifier. For organizations, there's ROR, the registry, no, the Research Organization Registry, and there's Ringgold, which is the so like ISNI derived PID for organizations. ISNI is mostly something for contributors to media content. So media can be a book, can be a video, can be um, audio content, and all the publishers, for example, have a ring goal to be identified because media content and many universities also have a ring goal. And then you can have PIDs on many other things. You can have PIDs for grants, for publications, projects. So for example, for publications, you have the Y. For grants also, it's the Y rate. For project, IGSN, which is for sample, is the International Generic Sample Number. And PIDs have many benefits. So just very briefly, so permanent identifier is a long-lasting reference to a resource. So a PID gives you indication about the provenance. Who's the identifier? What is it related to? It gives you heaps of metadata about the resource. Who is the resource? What is the resource? All sorts of additional information you may have about the resource. It's persistent. How do I know it is persistent? Because there are policies and guarantees around it. So for example, RAID, which is the PID for project, the lead agent for the RAID consortium is the Australian Research Data Commons, like Microscopy Australia, like the National Imaging Facility. It is funded through the Federal Research Infrastructure Scheme. ARDC gets funding for 5 years. It could disappear within 5 years or 10 years or later than that. But there are contingency plans. For example, EOSC and SURF in the Netherlands are part of the RAID consortium. And if I remember well, SURF, for example, could take over the leadership of the RAID consortium. And it's long lasting, or long is long. Again, not temporary. And also, it's important that PID enables machine readability, because that's the key, for example, for FAIR principles. So one of the many benefits of PID is the PID graph, which is basically, in this graph, you can draw relationships between all sorts of resources. It is not exhaustive, it's just as an example. So for example, an institution can be a funder, but also an author, a person, can be affiliated with an institution. And then when you publish, you have the author that is added as a PID to the publication metadata. A publication is fed with datasets, and datasets are identified. Datasets come from an instrument that you can identify. And someone operates the instruments, maybe does more than just operates. And that's the instrument scientist, who may also contribute, for example, to analysis of the data, who may also contribute to the publication as an author, or maybe as being acknowledged. In a publication, you cite software. So how can you basically identify the software? And you have heaps of other resources, for example, that you could identify. And just very briefly, for example, the instrument, you would use DataCite, DOI, people, you would use NORCID, institution, whether it's a funder or where someone is, it's the ROR ID. So there's the Crossref funder ID that you may be aware of. Crossref is sunsetting its funder ID in the benefit of ROR. And then you can identify projects with RAID, which is the research activity identifier. Why investing in PIDs? In 2021, the Australian Research Data Commons, the ARDC, and the Australian Access Federation, that's the lead for Australia for ORCID, the ORCID consortium in the country, commissioned More Brains to do a cost-benefit analysis of PIDs in Australia. It was following a similar report by More Brain for the UK research environment for JISC, and they identified three main advantages of PIDs: metadata reuse. The PID is associated with metadata. You have heaps of information with this metadata, and you can link the information with metadata, and you can also, metadata is a way to standardize the information provided by PIDs. Thanks to PID, you can automate a lot of tasks. Machine readability is a big advantage of PIDs. And also, if you have if you have a PID for everything, you can do so much analysis. For example, for a university, if they have a PID for everything and everyone that are within the university, they can do impact analysis. They can benchmark the university against other universities. So you can do a lot. And for a facility, for example, it can also measure its impact thanks to PIDs. So in this report, they estimated that basically the PIDs would allow to more like the absence of PIDs or systematic usage of PIDs cost $24 million Australian dollars per annum, because basically it's information that is re-entered manually so many times about various resources across the university, and that's equivalent to 38,000 person days per annum. So it has, and 24 million is a conservative estimate. So there was a case for a national PID strategy, which was actually a recommendation of this report. And that was in 2023, and the report was published earlier this year in February. And it was a collaborative approach led by ARDC that involved universities, research infrastructures, such as National Imaging Facility, Microscopy Australia. Funders were very interested from the very beginning. The two main ones, the Australian Research Council and the National and Health Medical Research Councils. Publishers, we had someone from Wiley, for example, involved. And very interestingly, governments were very interested, in particular, Treasury. Yeah, interesting. And just very briefly, the strategy was not to be exhaustive. So there was just a few working groups that were formed, and for example, focusing on grants, instruments, organizations and facilities, projects, national collections, what we called NTROs, non-traditional research outputs, for example, a piece of clothing, ceramics, a recipe, poem. We need to think about the broader scope of research, arts, human sciences, for example, archaeology. Observations, how do you identify an observation? I guess more like in, for example, I know the people involved were more like in astronomy, for example. So how do you, first, do you need to identify it? And how would you identify it? Environmental assessment, and very importantly, there was a working group on how to engage the government in this strategy. So me, for example, I worked on the working groups on instruments and organizations and facilities. So for example, like identify organizations outside research. So there's role. Outside research, there are many, but they all have a specific purpose, or they are privately owned. So they're not necessarily a good alternative. Like all the countries have a sort of like business number, registration numbers. In general, they would say they are unique, but in general, there are no rules that after some time, those that have not been used for a long time may be recycled. So the business numbers are not necessarily unique over a long time. And this strategy led to a roadmap that started this year with 3 action groups or working groups, institutions, again, research infrastructures, and funders. And each action group has a number of missions, basically. And Microscopy Australia is in the one about infrastructure. And as Wojtek yesterday mentioned, the National Digital Research Infrastructure Strategy, it's a bit of a mouthful. Just in the document, actually, the PID strategy and roadmap were identified as a deliverable that was necessary to achieve standardization in practices around data. So what does Microscopy Australia does in terms of PIDs? So we've identified priority PIDs, which are basically the same sort of that the nationally have been identified. So ORCID for people, RAW for organizations in general, DOI about research outputs and grants. RAID, I have sort of like graded out because RAID will do some like feasibility study, but we're not there yet. And RAID has also some conditions. For example, you have to publish minimum information within 2 years after the RAID has been minted. And for many projects that use sensitive data, commercial, clinical data, that they may not want to have this minimum information released. So for ORCID, so Australia is actually quite a success story for the ORCID consortium in terms of adoption. In a very short time, there was a high level of adoption of ORCID by academic researchers. Academic researchers, that means those who publish, because basically the funders made it a lot easier if you use the ORCID. But if you think of facility staff, they contribute to research. They contribute to papers very often. Sometimes they may be acknowledged, but sometimes versus authors. And across our facilities, we have a low kind of uptake of ORCID, partly because in general in Australia, universities have not targeted so like non-academic researchers, because our facility staff, many of them, I think they are researchers. RAW, so we'll aim to have all of our facilities already, basically. They have a RAW ID to be identified, which is not exclusive with respect to the university RAW. Research outputs, so publications, all publications should have a DOI and datasets. And we're also trialing with ARDC. So Crossref has started also like using DOI to identify grants, and Australia is one of the partners in this pilot. And even though they're not PIDs, I also would like to highlight we're promoting sort of PID schema to identify instruments using dataset DOIs. And associated with ORCID, there's credit, which is the contributor role taxonomy. So it is something that started a few years ago. And I think for maybe like 2 or 3 years, NIST is looking after credit. And I really would like to have progress on credit. Because basically with credit, you may already see that in some papers. Some publishers use that, and in the back end is credit. When, for example, you submit your paper, and you need to add who contributed to the design of the experiment, who contributed to the analysis, who contributed to the writing of the paper. That is something that credit captures. But so nowadays, it hasn't been really systematically adopted, and it's not necessarily encoded within ORCID. So I really would like to credit to have some significant and fast progress in that regard. And so Microscopy Australia, we're a network of 9 university-based facilities. That means that Microscopy Australia alone, headquarters, there's so much we can't do, but there's also so much that we can do. So each university has its own data governance policies, but also like culture. So we have 9 on them to deal with. And as a result, they own on their own journey in terms of data management, fair care principles, adoption of PIDs, systematic use of PIDs. So what we can do is basically promote best practices and advocate for convergence. And also we're very diverse. We have basically so many, we're covering almost the whole spectrum of research, like geosciences, biosciences, ecosciences, physical sciences. So different cultures, for example, in general, ecosciences tend to be, historically in Australia, have been early adopters of PIDs. Other disciplines are lagging a lot more. It's not, I should say, it's not because of a lack of willingness. It's just because we're not aware about it, or we're not enabled to use them. So just as a conclusion, getting a PID is easy. If you want a RAW ID, you go to raw.org, you apply for it, it's free. I don't know how long it takes. In our case, it was early on where we were moving from one server to another, so it took a few months. But my understanding now, it takes a few hours or a few days. It's manually curated, so it's reliable. So it's easy. But then what do you do with it? It has to be used. It has to be captured. So we need to have sustainable metadata collection for example, at the facility, and it must be transparent, seamless, consistent, and systematic with minimum human intervention. Okay, the title of the dataset, brief description of dataset, that's all. So that implies ingestion of metadata from various sources, interoperability between various information systems, for example, within a university, and the institutional environment for that is very important. So it's a lot of engagement and advocating for changes and interoperability between those systems. And as to conclude, basically, imagine if you could capture metadata, at the time of data acquisition at the instrument, or before you handed the data over to the researcher, you could capture all of that and most likely a lot more. And that, I think, is the key. And this is what you could achieve with PIDs. So thank you very much. And just to, sorry, last slide. Next year, if you want to come to Brisbane, Australia, foundingGIDE will be Friday, Saturday. There will be a barbecue, most likely. And Roger has suggested that we could go to actually a research station that is on an island owned by UQ. Yeah. But interestingly, just before foundingGIDE, there's International Data Week. SciDataConf and Research Data Alliance have their annual conference at Brisbane next year. I think it's a lot of people that foundingGIDE should talk to. And the week after, there's eResearch Australasia, and I'm pretty sure the PID roadmap and strategy will be quite a highlight because we'll be like 2 years in, and it's a very nice, very social, very friendly conference. So if you want to have 2 weeks of holidays and conferencing, come to Brisbane.